Welcome to Next Round with the Pacific Research Institute. I'm your host, Rowena Ichon. In this podcast, Tim and I, PRI's Director of Communications, and I chat with Mark Cunningham, opinion editor of the New York Post. New York and California have a lot in common: high taxes, overregulation, a housing affordability crisis, rising crime in the cities, and a state government that's dominated by one party. Join us as we talk about all things blue in New York and California. Thanks for listening. Welcome to Next Round, Mark.
Hey, thanks.
So California and New York have one big thing in common: one party rule in our respective state capitals. In California, we've been in this situation for more than 2 decades now, but in New York, you've generally had a divided legislature for much of your recent history. What are the political forces that turned Albany, like Sacramento, all blue?
It's been a variety of things, and I guess what I would say the number one cause is that sort of big government begets more big government. New York moved toward big government big time, under Nelson Rockefeller in the 1960s, adopting the largest Medicaid program in the nation and other major steps forward, and became increasingly a high tax state. The Republicans primarily in the state Senate, because the Assembly went Democratic long ago, went along with this because they were based largely further out than New York City. They were in lower cost areas, so the higher tax rate didn't hit them as hard. They somewhat cynically bought into the idea that we were taxing New York City rich people and it's benefiting my district. But the overall impact of high taxes, heavy regulations has just slowly been squeezing Republican-leaning people out. Upstate is a bit of a desert economically these days, and that combined with sort of the tax-defying entrepreneurial powers of a large city like New York have just swung the demographic balance towards Democrat. And then you've got just sort of the national trend that I would say, basically the left's takeover of the universities has pushed more and more people in the knowledge classes or knowledge industries to the left. So so that's had its impact too. So that even in the city, you used to have pockets of that would send Republicans to Congress and so on, and those have just gradually died out. So even for much of the last 5+ years, and really for longer, the Republicans had held on to the Senate just as much through gerrymandering as anything else, that the grasp was getting weaker and weaker, and eventually it just burst. I mean, in a sense, we got the big government first, and that brought the trend, but I think most of the larger trends are the same in both states.
Let's talk about some of the issues, starting with single-payer health care and the New York Health Act. So here in California, there's been a lot of talk about single-payer, but we don't think it's going to happen this year, namely because of the $400 billion price tag. Governor Newsom has been active on the front, and he's proposed an individual mandate to buy health insurance. So what are the prospects on your end for your New York Health Act passing this year?
It's not going to happen, I don't think, for much the same reason. I mean, even in high tax states, high spending states, just the added hit is just too much. And even if they fudge the numbers, it's still just insane, particularly with the limits on the SALT deduction and so on and so forth. It's not something that any state can really do. I think several states have blinked in the recent past. Vermont did a few years ago. I think this is California's second time blinking, isn't it? It really is only going to happen, I think, as a national thing, unless, I suppose conceivably, a Democratic president and Congress could subsidize one state to try it or something like that. But absent something like that, or the state would have to turn farther left than anything in this country has yet to really get there. But instead, we'll just get more regulations, more mandates, more tinkering at the edges, state by state. As I think California, I believe, and certainly New York had a good bunch of the Obamacare regulations before the feds mandated them nationwide. We had guaranteed issue, we had community rating, and all that. So I would predict more meddling with the market that makes the problem worse and therefore seems to support the case for more meddling, but it's going to be gradualist rather than one fell swoop.
Another issue we have in common is a lack of housing affordability in our state. So in California, voters defeated a rent control initiative that would have repealed our existing state laws forbidding cities from enacting their own rent control laws. We're reading headlines that New York is moving closer to universal rent control. How would this work? Would it actually make the housing problem even worse in New York?
It presumably would. What is actually on the table is a requirement that the rent stabilization laws that apply in New York City would apply statewide, but I think that is primarily just a gambit in order to make other extensions. They'll give up on that in exchange for getting further tightening down of the rent stabilization laws in the city. Other than sort of people who are paid to say otherwise, there's very little support for the idea that rent control does anything but suppress the creation, the housing supply, because just like any other price control, and that's certainly what it's done in New York City. Of course, there are other things that suppress the supply, like zoning and environmental protections and so on and so forth, which I guess has had more to do with the problems in California. But what we're going to get is an increase in the rent controls in New York City so that it's harder for apartments to price out of rent control as current law allows, and just generally make the laws apply to more units than they otherwise would.
So New York is said to be the safest large state in America, but we're seeing so-called criminal justice reform now becoming a big part of the state's legislative agenda. And that includes things like eliminating bail and proposals that are kinder and gentler on those who commit crimes, as well as the legalization of marijuana. And all of these things seem to be advancing through the legislature. Well, here in California, thanks to 3 strikes and other tough-on-crime laws, we saw crime drop dramatically over the past couple of decades, but we're now facing so-called reforms that, may be contributing to several categories of crime increasing. So like California, do you see a similar shift in attitudes now in New York, with the Empire State poised to become soft on crime and reverse the accomplishments of Mayor Giuliani?
I'm going to talk primarily about New York City. There's at least 2 things going on. There's policing, and then there's the rest of the criminal justice system, i.e., the courts and the laws, sort of the judges and so on who do the sentencing. There is a national criminal justice reform movement, which is at least partly bipartisan. I mean, President Trump just passed last year passed a bipartisan criminal justice reform. Several states have done quite a bit. There's good criminal justice reform that most people would embrace. Then you've got the more extreme stuff, which has lots of people worried. Does eliminating cash bail or eliminating it for X category of offenses, is that prudent? Sort of that we're going to have to see. I know that I believe it's Maryland did it a few years ago, and what it meant was that more people were remanded without bail than had previously been. So it's not clear that the advocates will really get what they want when all the changes ring out. But it's certainly a concern, as is the decriminalization of things. I mean, pot, again, we're going to have to see how that works out. There are actually interesting phenomenon where both in New York and New Jersey, the legalization of pot has been stopped. Both in New Jersey's new governor has been trying very hard to legalize pot, and the Democratic legislature has not done it, and has been a year and a half now, or very close, that he's failed. Just concerns that a plainly Democratic constituent share, but that's sort of a side issue on criminal justice reform. But what we also have are quality of life offenses like subway turnstile jumping, public urination, that either the penalties are being loosened or DAs are refusing to prosecute. That includes refusing to prosecute simple possession of pot and things like that. And again, many of us are worried about what the long-term impact is, but it's very hard to point to what it will be. Our legislature just eliminated bail for most charges, except the more serious and violent felonies, and we're going to have to see how that plays out. Another concern, of course, is that the reformers aren't going to wait to see how that plays out before pushing for more reforms. I'm not sure quite what those would be, but New York just the year before we passed the Raise the Age law, which essentially mandated that anyone under 18 be tried as a juvenile, probably in family court, which has, of course, seems to have led to gangs and so on using teenagers as mules and other things because they know they won't wind up going to prison. But against that, and a very important thing, is that what happened under Mayor Rudy Giuliani and his first police commissioner, Bill Bratton, was a change in policing in New York City, where the police started doing their jobs under the leadership of a new management of the NYPD. And that meant intervening proactive, not simply trying to solve crimes, but to protect public order. Bratton has written extensively on this, and it was really a historic model of policing going back to modern policing's founding in London in the 19th century. And that was what really made key difference in turning around crime in New York City, ahead of the national decline in crime, which it started a couple of years after and continuing long after the major national decline in crime. And so far, even with reforms and sort of consent decrees that have us worried that govern the NYPD and so on, so far the decline in crime seems to have continued. The statistics say it's continued under Mayor Bill de Blasio, who is generally seen as about as liberal as you're going to get. We have to see and cross our fingers, basically.
So like California, New York is a high-tax state. Residents have had to deal with the elimination of state and local tax deductions. New York has developed some interesting ways to get around the salt tax limitations. Have they gone anywhere?
Not really. What Governor Cuomo tried to do, it was sort of a grab bag of things. One was simply, and I believe this was tried elsewhere, to set up a new quote-unquote charitable contribution, which was really paying your taxes as via a charitable giving, and the IRS stomped all over that. Still, Cuomo's theoretically fighting it in federal court, but it's not going to work. Another was this complicated workaround where employers would raise their payroll tax, which would allow them to deduct. They'd raise pay and raise the payroll tax. That would pay taxes, and again, it's a very complicated Rube Goldberg thing, which hasn't taken effect. It's so complicated that essentially no one's even tried to exploit that loophole. The bottom line is that the SALT deduction is capped, and high tax states are going to have to deal with it. None of them want to, and in New York, for all of his talk about the horrible impact of the loss of the SALT tax, Cuomo just called for and successfully got the extension of our supposedly temporary millionaires tax, just because the state government needs the money if it's going to keep spending $175 billion a year is, I think, the latest state budget.
So let's turn to education. The Supreme Court's Janus decision last year has made the teachers' unions as militant as ever. And here we've seen teacher strikes in Los Angeles and Oakland and most recently in Sacramento. And Governor Newsom and the legislature are pushing to limit the expansion of charter schools while expanding very expensive, universal preschool programs. We know that similar moves are happening in New York. Talk about some of those.
Unfortunately, our teachers' unions don't have to get militant because they already have so much power. They can get their way much more quietly than going on strike. They have had one small limit in that the governor is not a big fan, and as long as the Republicans ran the state Senate, they also were supportive of charter schools, even not in their districts, but supportive of the concept, and open to the people who are willing to fight for that cause. And the charter schools have been a success, most notably in New York City, where they have about 10% of the public school population now enrolled, and that'll rise a bit because as some of the existing schools grow. Unfortunately, the law did cap the total number of charter schools statewide and in the city, and the city is basically at its cap. So the growth is going to be pretty limited from now on unless that cap can be extended, whereas at this point, the now fully Democratic legislature is more likely to just pass more regulations, making it harder for charters to function. And again, all this basically at the behest of the teacher unions, which see charters as an existential threat, since they're largely non-union and definitely not as bureaucratic. And the bureaucracies and the unions have this sort of painful symbiosis that helps explain why so much of American education is so mediocre. Again, my impression was that for all the talk of the LA strike, at least being about class size or teacher pay or whatever, it really was about shutting down charters or stopping charters. And I think you're going to see the unions, nationally focused on that. Janus is a somewhat different issue. Again, here in New York, it seems like the unions have managed to minimize the impact by making it very hard for someone to actually get out of the union by passing laws such that you have to do it on 3 days, one of 3 days, just after the tax deadline. It's scummy. Again, Janus, it seems to me, it's not by itself going to roll back the power of public unions. That's going to take something else.
So let's turn to Amazon. So here in LA or in California, we never thought that we had a chance to really win over Amazon's second headquarters, but New York won. And the amazing thing is that Amazon was run out of town. Talk about this bit of drama with us and what do local residents think after snatching defeat from the jaws of victory and seeing billions of dollars in new investment and thousands of jobs disappear?
Well, I think most locals, according to polls and the people I talk to are dispirited that Amazon was driven out. That said, I think you have to apportion some of the blame to Amazon itself because the way they ran their national competition, it certainly seemed like they were holding an auction as to who would pay them the most, which ironically it's going to unite both the left and the right in resenting it. The right because it's against subsidies generally, and the left because at least they don't like the idea of bribing large corporations at least to do anything. So then when the governor and the mayor announced the Amazon decision, they played up the subsidies as like a big deal, in part just to make it seem like they had done something big so they could take credit for getting Amazon here rather than it being the attractiveness of New York City for a corporate headquarters. That further inflamed not just public opinion but informed opinion. There were other local things that the governor failed to really lay all the political groundwork of sort of bringing some of the local politicians in on the negotiations. So other than the mayor, members of the state legislature from the affected areas, and they basically squawked. Unfortunately, New York City in particular has this habit of any large project winds up coming with something called a community benefits agreement, which is basically what bribes you're going to give to existing nonprofits and quote-unquote community groups, many of which are basically political clubs with a nonprofit arm, in order to be able to go ahead with your deal, to get the necessary approvals and so on and so forth. Cuomo and de Blasio, to some extent, tried to end-run the process and started running into problems. Amazon started to get the feeling that it was going to be held up for more than it had seen. And there may have been something going on behind the scenes at the company then, too. Can't say for sure, but they apparently didn't research the political culture of New York as well as they thought before going for it. And again, they were more surprised than they should have been. So, a complicated story, doesn't speak well of New York because is this endemic culture of looking for legal bribe to whenever a business comes calling or comes looking to grow, and it's why many businesses don't grow here, or when they grow to a certain size, they relocate elsewhere.
So we see that Mayor de Blasio has been traveling around the West Coast recently, and it seems like he's kicking the tires around, thinking about running for president. We saw he was recently just a couple of hours from us in Sacramento in Reno, Nevada. So what do you think? Will he take the plunge and join the 100 other Democrats running for president? And if he does, what should us Californians know about him?
He's going to run. I'm somewhat surprised because I just don't see his way forward. He's been a failure every time he's gone on the national stage to date. He's not drawing large crowds, but he seems very determined to do it. He'll be, I think, the 20th or 21st or 22nd to announce, depending on how long he delays. It's ridiculous. I guess the thing Californians should know most about de Blasio is that New Yorkers overwhelmingly don't want him to run. In polls of who is your preferred candidate among Democrats, de Blasio is at the bottom of the pack. Polls of New Yorkers about all the national Democratic candidates, he is remarkably full of himself, and he's largely surrounded himself with yes men and yes women who will occasionally leak to the press about how frustrated they are that he continues his presidential hopes, but they seemingly aren't willing or able to talk him out of it. It's ridiculous. His record here is basically pretty thin. He hasn't driven the city into a ditch. He's been wise and allowed the NYPD to do its job. There was a rocky first year or two where everyone was concerned about whether he was actually going to do that, but he settled down, and he hasn't destroyed anything much. It's just been, he was handed a city that was working pretty well, and he hasn't undone any of those essentials. Although he's been fairly generous to labor unions, and that those costs will be paying for years. He has greatly increased the public payroll, and that's going to be a problem whenever the next recession comes. Things like that. But he thinks he is this progressive icon who should have a national reputation. He may well figure that presidential campaign will at least increase his national profile, and so serve him well when he is term limited out of office in 2021. This may well be just him trying to improve his future earnings potential. I mean, that has to be the case for several of the others who are running, because there's way too many Democrats in the race.
So, Mark, we can't let you go without talking about AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. How influential is she, really? Is there still a fascination with her among New Yorkers, or is AOC fatigue starting to set in?
Well, there's definitely some AOC fatigue with her constituents because they can't seem to reach her. She hasn't. She may have opened one district office, but she definitely still. Her district is between the Bronx and Queens. It's split, so she really needs to have two district offices. And she went longer than any other freshman, at least around here, in opening any office. She obviously is very much focused on sort of her national agenda and on social media, in a sense, and that isn't sitting well with regular constituents who expect their congressman to act when the Social Security check doesn't come in, or all the millions of little problems that constituents services is supposed to address. I don't think she was ever a huge buzz among New Yorkers generally. It's more that she is gifted at social media. She is young and charismatic and a breath of fresh air. In some ways, she is certainly not your typical veteran politician, and that's given her, I would say, a national buzz more than it's given her particularly a New York buzz.
So for our last and favorite question, it's our tradition at Next Round to ask each guest for a wine or beer or cocktail or other recommendation. So what are you drinking these days to fortify yourself in this political season?
Well, I would like to recommend Long Island wines to all of California. No, I just want to note that my wife and I actually we go out to the North Fork of Long Island every summer, and there are some lovely wineries right by the beach there, and Californians bored and jaded by your wine country, could stop by and just see something different. But I generally, sort of my home from work drink is a gin and tonic, no exotic cocktails, and then we generally switch to red, usually a Cab or a Merlot, a Syrah. Nothing too unusual. I am conservative in my drinks as well.
Great. Thanks so much, Mark.
All right.
Thanks to our guest, Mark Cunningham. To learn more about our California work, go to our website at pacificresearch.org. If you're working on your vacation plans, consider mixing policy and cruising. Join PRI and the Claremont Institute for our joint 40th anniversary cruise on the Mediterranean. The cruise starts in Barcelona and ends in Rome with a special tour of the Vatican. Special guests include Andrew Roberts, author of Churchill, Walking with Destiny, our own Steve Hayward, Sally Pipes, and Charles Kessler. For more details, visit ci-pri.com. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. We hope you'll come back again for Next Round with PRI.